Danny Lawson had never seen so many aliens in one place. The Hall of Infinite Thought was massive, bigger than any stadium back on Earth, and every seat was filled with beings from across the galaxy. Some had scales. Some had wings. Some were made of living crystal that caught the light and split it into rainbows. Danny felt very small and very human as he walked to his seat in the back row. He was the first human ever accepted into the Valtteri Institute of Universal Knowledge. When the acceptance letter arrived 6 months ago, Danny thought it was a joke. Humans had only made contact with alien civilizations 12 years ago. They were still considered primitive by galactic standards. Most species saw Earth as a backwater planet filled with violent, emotional creatures who had barely figured out space travel. But here he was, sitting in the most famous hall in the known universe, waiting for an event that had happened every year for 4,000 years. Kira Mendez dropped into the seat beside him. She was the only other human at the Institute, a linguistics student who had arrived 2 years before Danny. Her dark hair was tied back, and she wore the silver robes that all students were required to wear during formal events. "You look nervous," she said. "I am nervous," Danny admitted. "Everyone keeps staring at me. They stare at me too. You get used to it." Kira smiled and patted his arm. "Just try to enjoy this. The final Enigma ceremony is legendary. Professor Yethkan has been asking the same riddle for 4,000 years, and nobody has ever solved it." Danny looked toward the central platform, where a tall, thin alien stood motionless. Professor Yethkan was a Zorvati, one of the oldest species in the galaxy. Her skin was pale blue and covered with patterns that glowed softly in the dim light. She had no eyes that Danny could see, but he knew she could sense everything around her through vibrations in the air. "Why does she keep asking if nobody can answer?" Danny asked. Kira shrugged. "That's the mystery. Some people think the riddle has no answer. Others think the answer is so complex that no mind in the galaxy can comprehend it. The Selthari have been trying to solve it for 3,000 years. They have the most powerful brains in the known universe, and even they can't figure it out." As if on cue, a group of Selthari students walked past Danny's row. They were insectoid beings with 4 arms and heads covered in antennae. Their compound eyes reflected the light like black mirrors. One of them stopped and looked down at Danny. "A human?" the Selthari said. His voice was sharp and clicking. "I did not know they allowed animals into the ceremony." Danny felt his face grow hot, but he said nothing. "Leave him alone, Vornax," Kira said. The Selthari made a sound that might have been laughter. "Do not worry. I'm not here to waste time on primitives. I am here to make history. Today, I will be the first being to solve the final enigma." He held up one of his 4 hands. "I have 12 advanced degrees. I have memorized the complete mathematical histories of 97 civilizations. I have connected my mind to the Selthari Hive Network, which gives me access to the combined intelligence of 40 billion individuals." "Good luck," Danny said quietly. Vornax stared at him for a moment, then walked away without another word. "Don't let him bother you," Kira whispered. "He's brilliant, but he's also the most arrogant person at this institute." Before Danny could respond, the lights in the hall began to dim. A deep silence fell over the crowd. Professor Yethkan raised her long arms, and the glowing patterns on her skin grew brighter. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the entire hall without any amplification. "Welcome to the 4023rd ceremony of the final enigma. I see before me the brightest minds from 17 species. I see mathematicians who have calculated the birth and death of stars. I see philosophers who have debated the nature of existence for centuries. I see warriors who have conquered entire systems with their strategic genius." She paused, and her patterns pulsed slowly. "And yet, In 4,000 years, through 200,000 attempts, not one being has answered my riddle correctly. A murmur ran through the crowd. Danny saw Vornax lean forward in his seat, his antennae twitching with anticipation. Some of you believe you will succeed where all others have failed, Professor Yethkan continued. Some of you believe your species' unique intelligence will unlock the answer. I welcome your confidence. But I warn you now, as I have warned every generation before you, this enigma does not test what you know. It tests something far deeper. She raised her hand, and a holographic display appeared in front of every seat in the hall. Danny looked at the glowing text floating before him. It was written in Standard Galactic, the common language used by all spacefaring civilizations. The riddle was long and complex. It spoke of existence and purpose. It asked about the relationship between consciousness and the universe. It presented a paradox that seemed to require understanding of quantum mechanics, temporal physics, philosophy, and mathematics all at once. Danny read it 3 times and felt his head begin to hurt. Around him, aliens were already working. The Selthari had closed their eyes and connected to their hive mind. A group of Melodari, musical beings from the gas giants of the Outer Rim, were humming complex harmonies as they tried to find the answer through sound. The crystalline beings in the front row had begun refracting light through their bodies, creating patterns on the ceiling. Kira was reading the riddle with a frown on her face. "This is impossible," she muttered. "How is anyone supposed to answer this?" Danny didn't respond. He was staring at the riddle, but he wasn't trying to solve it. He was watching the aliens around him, watching how they approached the problem. Something felt strange to him, something he couldn't quite name. Professor Yethkan stood perfectly still on the platform, her patterns glowing steadily. "You have until midnight," she announced. "The floor will open for answers in 1 hour. May wisdom guide you all." Danny looked at the riddle again. Then he looked at Professor Yethkan. Then he looked at the hundreds of brilliant aliens working furiously around him. And for the first time since arriving at the Institute, Danny Lawson smiled. 6 hours had passed since the ceremony began, and the Hall of Infinite Thought had transformed into something like a battlefield. Everywhere Danny looked, aliens were struggling, arguing, and failing. Vornax stood at the central platform, his forearms moving rapidly as he presented yet another answer to Professor Yethkan. Holographic equations floated around him, so complex that they made Danny's eyes water just looking at them. "The answer lies in the quantum relationship between consciousness and universal entropy," Vornax declared. His voice was confident, but Danny noticed that his antennae were shaking slightly. "If we calculate the precise moment when awareness intersects with the heat death of the universe, we arrive at a value of incorrect," Professor Yethkan said calmly. Vornax froze. The equations around him flickered and disappeared. For a moment, the great Selthari genius looked like a child who had been told his drawing was not good enough. "That was my 47th attempt," he said. "I have used every mathematical framework known to the Selthari collective. I have consulted with the greatest minds of 40 billion individuals. How can I still be wrong?" Professor Yethkan said nothing. Her glowing patterns pulsed once, and she turned to face the rest of the hall. "Next," she said. Vornax walked back to his seat, his compound eyes dark with frustration. As he passed Danny, he did not even bother to insult him. He seemed too defeated to care about anything. Kira leaned over to Danny. "That's the closest anyone has gotten in 200 years, she whispered. The professors in the physics department said his equations were beautiful, but wrong. Danny said, double quotes, "Yes, but wrong." A new challenger approached the platform. Commander Talus was a Kathrani, a warrior species from a harsh desert world. She was tall and muscular, with gray skin covered in scars from countless battles. Unlike most Kethrani, she had chosen the path of knowledge over war. She had traveled across the entire galaxy to be here today. "I have studied your riddle for 70 years," Commander Tallis announced. Her voice was deep and rough. "I have consulted the ancient wisdom texts of my people. I have meditated in the silence of dead stars. I have sought understanding in pain, in loss, and in victory." Professor Yethkan waited patiently. Commander Tallis closed her eyes. "The answer is this. Consciousness exists to witness the universe so that the universe may know itself. Purpose is the reflection of existence looking back at its source. The paradox resolves when we understand that the question and the answer are the same." The hall went silent. Danny thought it sounded like a good answer. It was deep and philosophical. It made sense in a poetic way. "Incorrect," Professor Yethkan said. Commander Tallis's eyes opened slowly. She did not argue or complain. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked out of the hall without looking back. 70 years of searching ended in a single word. Danny watched her go and felt something heavy settle in his chest. "This is insane," Kira muttered. "What does she want? What answer could possibly be right?" Danny didn't respond. He was still looking at the riddle floating in front of him, but he wasn't reading the words anymore. He was thinking about the question itself. Not what it asked, but why it was being asked around him. The other species continued their attempts. The Melodari sang complex harmonies that made the air vibrate with strange energy. The crystalline beings created light patterns so intricate that some students had to look away to avoid dizziness. A group of telepathic beings from the inner systems tried to probe Professor Yethkan's mind directly, but she blocked them without effort. One by one, they all failed. Hours passed. Students began to leave the hall in frustration. Some were crying. Others were angry. A few had to be carried out after pushing their minds too hard trying to find the answer. Kira put her hand on Danny's arm. "We should go," she said. "There's nothing we can do here. This riddle wasn't made for beings like us." Danny shook his head slowly. "I want to stay a little longer." Kira sighed but didn't argue. She was used to Danny being stubborn. Danny leaned back in his seat and watched Professor Yethkan. She had not moved from the platform in 6 hours. Her patterns glowed steadily, unchanging, patient. She had watched 200,000 beings fail over 4,000 years, and she would probably watch 200,000 more. But why? That was the question that kept circling in Danny's mind. Not the riddle itself, but the reason behind it. Why would someone spend 4,000 years asking a question that nobody could answer? What was the point? He thought about his teachers back on Earth. He remembered Mrs. Patterson, his philosophy teacher in high school. She used to say that the best questions were the ones that made you think, not the ones that had easy answers. She said that sometimes the question was more important than the answer. Danny sat up straight. He looked at the riddle again. He read every word carefully. Then he looked at Professor Yethkan, and he noticed something he had missed before. Every time someone gave a wrong answer, her patterns pulsed in exactly the same way. It was not disappointment. It was not boredom. It was something else. It was waiting. She was waiting for something specific. Not a calculation. Not a formula. Not ancient wisdom or mathematical genius. She was waiting for someone to understand something that all these brilliant minds had missed. Danny's heart began to beat faster. A crazy idea formed in his mind. It was so simple that it seemed stupid. Everyone else was treating the riddle like a problem to be solved. But what if it wasn't a problem at all? What if it was a lesson? Kira was looking at him strangely. "Danny, are you okay? You look weird." Danny stood up slowly. His legs felt shaky. Around him, the remaining students watched with confusion. The human had not even tried to answer the riddle. He had just sat there for 6 hours doing nothing. "I need to ask the professor something," Danny said. Kira grabbed his arm. "What? You can't just walk up there without an answer. Everyone will laugh at you." Danny smiled, even though his stomach was doing flips. "Maybe, but I need to ask anyway." He walked toward the platform. The Selthari students snickered. A few other aliens whispered to each other. Vornax looked up from his calculations and stared at Danny with something like pity. Professor Yefkan turned to face the young human. Her patterns did not change, but Danny felt her attention focus on him like a spotlight. "A human," she said. There was no mockery in her voice, just curiosity. "You wish to attempt an answer?" Danny took a deep breath. "Not exactly," he said. "First, I want to ask you a question." The hall went completely silent. Nobody had ever asked Professor Yefkan a question during the final Enigma ceremony. For 4,000 years, students came to answer, not to ask. The idea was so strange that the aliens in the hall did not know how to react. Vornax made a clicking sound of disgust. "This is a waste of time. The human cannot even follow basic protocol." But Professor Yefkan raised one long hand, and silence fell over the hall again. "You wish to ask me a question," she repeated. Her voice was calm, but Danny thought he heard something new in it. Interest, perhaps. Or hope. That is unusual. But I will allow it. Ask. Danny's mouth felt dry. He was standing in front of the greatest mind in the galaxy, surrounded by beings who thought he was nothing more than a primitive creature from a primitive world. Every logical part of his brain was screaming, and him to sit back down and stop embarrassing himself. But Mrs. Patterson had always said that the bravest thing a person could do was ask a question when everyone else thought they already had the answer. "Professor," Danny said, "why do you ask this riddle every year?" The hall remained silent, but Danny could feel the confusion spreading through the crowd. It was such a simple question. It seemed completely unrelated to the complex, philosophical puzzle that had defeated 200,000 minds. Professor Yefkan did not answer immediately. Her patterns, which had glowed steadily all night, flickered slightly. "It is tradition," she said finally. "I ask because I wish to find the being who is worthy of ultimate understanding." Danny nodded slowly. "And in 4,000 years, you haven't found them?" "No." "But you keep asking?" "Yes." Danny looked at the holographic riddle still floating in the air around him. He looked at the equations and philosophical arguments and quantum calculations that other species had created trying to solve it. Then he looked back at Professor Yefkan. "I think I understand now," he said. Vornax stood up from his seat. "This is ridiculous." "He understands nothing. He's stalling because he has no answer." "Let him speak," Professor Yefkan said. Her voice was sharp, sharper than Danny had heard it all night. Vornax sat back down immediately. The professor turned back to Danny. "You say you understand. Explain." Danny took a deep breath. He thought about all the brilliant aliens who had tried to solve this riddle. They had used mathematics and science and philosophy and ancient wisdom. They had connected their minds to networks of billions of individuals. They had meditated for decades, and they had all failed because they were all trying to solve the riddle. "Everyone who comes here tries to find the answer," Danny said. "They treat your riddle like a problem. They think that if they're smart enough, if they calculate long enough, if they know enough, they will figure it out. But that's not what you're looking for, is it?" Professor Yefkan said nothing, but her patterns began to pulse faster. "Your riddle asks about existence and purpose in consciousness," Danny continued. "It asks why we search for meaning in the universe. And everyone tries to answer that question by explaining what meaning is. They try to define it. They try to calculate it. They try to prove it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But you can't calculate meaning. You can't prove purpose. These aren't problems with solutions. They're questions that lead to more questions. The Zilthari tried to compute the answer with the combined intelligence of 40 billion minds. Commander Talus meditated for 70 years. But they all missed the point. Danny looked directly at Professor Yefkan. The riddle doesn't have an answer. Not in the way they're looking for it. Because the answer isn't something you find. It's something you realize. The hall was completely silent. Even the Melodari had stopped humming. And what? Professor Yefkan said softly, "Do you realize?" Danny smiled. It was a small, tired smile, the smile of someone who had finally found the end of a long journey. The answer is, because the search itself is the meaning. For a moment, nothing happened. The words hung in the air, so simple compared to all the complex answers that had come before. Danny heard someone laugh quietly in the back of the hall. He heard Varnax make a sound of disbelief. Then Professor Yefkan's skin began to change. The patterns that had glowed blue for 4,000 years shifted. They turned from blue to gold to deep purple, to colors that Danny had no name for. The change spread across her entire body like a wave, and the light she produced grew so bright that many students had to shield their eyes. The laughter stopped immediately. "Professor?" Someone called out. "What is happening?" Professor Yefkan did not respond. She was staring at Danny, and for the first time, he felt like she was truly seeing him. Not as a primitive creature from a backwater planet. Not as an unlikely student who didn't belong, but as something else entirely. 4,023 years, she said. Her voice trembled slightly. 200,000 attempts. And a human child answers in a single sentence. Danny felt his heart pounding in his chest. Is that correct? The colors on Professor Yefkan's skin settled into a warm, steady gold. It was a color that no one at the Institute had ever seen on a Zovathi before. Yes, she said. That is correct. The hall exploded into chaos. Students jumped to their feet, shouting in a dozen different languages. Some demanded to know how this was possible. Others insisted it must be a mistake. Vornax stood frozen in place, his compound eyes wide with shock, his antennae completely still. Kira was screaming Danny's name, but he could barely hear her over the noise. Professor Yefkan raised her hand, and the chaos died down immediately. The human has answered the final enigma, she announced. For the first time in 4,000 years, a being has understood the truth. The search for meaning is itself the meaning. The question is the answer. This has always been the lesson I wish to teach. She looked around the hall at all the brilliant minds who had failed. You sought to solve the riddle with your intelligence, she said. But intelligence alone cannot grasp the nature of existence. It requires something more, something that this young human possesses. She turned back to Danny. It requires the wisdom to know that some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be asked again and again, forever. Because that is what gives life its purpose. Danny stood alone on the platform, surrounded by the shocked silence of 1,000 aliens. And he had no idea what to say. So he said the only thing that felt right. Thank you for asking. Professor Yefkan's golden patterns pulsed once, and Danny could have sworn she smiled. The news spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours, every major civilization knew what had happened at the Velthari Institute. A human, a member of a species that had only discovered space travel a few decades ago, had solved the unsolvable riddle. The primitive beings from the small blue planet had done what the greatest minds in the universe could not. Danny spent the next 3 days being interviewed, questioned, and examined by scientists from a dozen different species. They scanned his brain. They tested his intelligence. They asked him to solve complex mathematical problems, which he failed miserably. They seemed unable to believe that someone so ordinary could have accomplished something so extraordinary. Your cognitive abilities are well below average by galactic standards, one Selthari scientist told him with obvious confusion. Your working memory is limited. Your processing speed is slow. How did you answer the riddle? Danny just shrugged. I didn't try to solve it. I tried to understand it. The scientist stared at him for a long moment, then walked away muttering to himself. On the fourth day, Danny was summoned to the council chambers at the center of the institute. It was a room he had never been allowed to enter before. Only the most important beings in the galaxy were permitted inside. Kira walked with him to the massive golden doors. I can't go in with you, she said, squeezing his hand. But I'll be right here when you come out. Danny nodded and stepped through the doors alone. The council chamber was smaller than he expected. It was a circular room with no furniture except a single platform in the center where Danny was clearly meant to stand. Around the edges of the room floated 12 beings of different species, each one representing a founding member of the Galactic Council of Knowledge. At the head of the chamber hovered High Chancellor Meverus. Danny had read about her in his orientation materials. She was a luminari, a being of pure energy who had lived for over 3,000 years. She had no physical body, just a glowing form that shifted and changed like a living flame. Danny Lawson of Earth, High Chancellor Meverus said. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Step forward. Danny walked to the center platform, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. We have reviewed the events of the final Enigma ceremony, the High Chancellor continued. We have confirmed that your answer was accepted by Professor Yethkan. This is the first time in 4,023 years that any being has accomplished this feat. Danny didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Tell us, said a Kethrani council member, how you arrived at your answer. We have the most powerful minds in the galaxy on this council, and none of us can understand how a human solved what we could not. Danny thought carefully before speaking. I didn't solve anything, he said. That's the point. Everyone else tried to solve the riddle because that's how they approach problems. They see a question and they look for an answer. But I grew up on Earth, and humans have been asking questions about meaning and purpose for thousands of years. We've never found the answer, but we keep asking anyway. He paused and looked around the chamber. Where I come from, there's an old saying, the journey is more important than the destination. I think Professor Yethkan's riddle was trying to teach that lesson. The search for meaning is itself meaningful. If you ever found a final answer, the search would be over and something important would be lost. The council members were silent. Danny could feel their attention focused on him like a physical weight. Fascinating, High Chancellor Meverus said finally. Your species has not yet developed faster than light travel independently. You have limited lifespans. Your technology is primitive by galactic standards. And yet you possess something that we have somehow lost. What is that? Danny asked. Humility, the High Chancellor said. The wisdom to accept that some things cannot be known. The courage to keep searching anyway. We have spent so long perfecting our intelligence that we forgot the value of doubt. She floated closer to Danny, and he felt warmth radiating from her energy form. Professor Yethkan has requested a meeting with the council, she said. She wishes to explain the origin of her riddle. We will hear her now. The doors behind Danny opened and Professor Yethkan entered the chamber. Her skin was still glowing gold, the color it had turned when Danny answered her riddle. She moved slowly, like someone carrying a heavy burden that was finally being lifted. High Chancellor, she said, bowing slightly. Council members, thank you for allowing me to speak. Proceed, High Chancellor Meverus said. Professor Yethkan turned to face Danny. 4,030 years ago, I was a young scholar, traveling the outer reaches of the galaxy in search of knowledge. On a small colony world near the border of unexplored space, I met a dying human. Danny felt his breath catch in his throat. A human? 30 years before first contact? He was a philosopher, Professor Yethkan continued. A teacher from Earth who had somehow ended up far from home. I never learned how he got there, and he died before he could tell me. But in his final hours, we talked about life and meaning and purpose. He had no advanced technology, no special abilities. He was simply a man who had spent his whole life asking questions. Her patterns pulsed slowly. He told me that humans had been searching for the meaning of life for thousands of years. I asked him if they had found it. He laughed and said no. I asked why they kept searching if there was no answer. And he said something I have never forgotten. She looked at Danny with something that might have been tears. Though her species did not have eyes, he said, because the search itself is the meaning. The chamber was absolutely silent. I designed my riddle that same night, Professor Yethkan said. I have been asking it ever since, hoping that someday another being would understand what that dying human taught me. In 4,000 years, no one did. Until now, she bowed deeply to Danny. Thank you, she said, for proving that his wisdom lives on in your species. High Chancellor Mevers's form brightened significantly. In light of these events, she announced, the Council has decided to grant humanity something that has never been given to any species so quickly. Danny Lawson, your people have earned a permanent seat on the Galactic Council of Knowledge. You will be the first human to represent Earth among the stars. Danny's legs felt weak. I don't understand. I'm nobody. I'm just a student. High Chancellor Mevers laughed, and it sounded like music. That, she said, is exactly why you deserve this honor. 1 year had passed since Danny Lawson answered the final Enigma, and the galaxy had changed in ways no one expected. The graduation ceremony at the Veltri Institute was always a grand event, but this year it was something more. Representatives from over 50 civilizations had traveled across the stars to attend. Holographic projections broadcast the ceremony to trillions of beings on thousands of worlds. Everyone wanted to see the human who had done the impossible. Danny stood backstage, adjusting his silver robes nervously. His hands were shaking. You need to relax, Kira said, standing beside him. You faced down the greatest minds in the galaxy. A graduation speech should be easy. That was different, Danny said. That was just me being confused about a riddle. This is me having to say something meaningful in front of the entire universe. Kira laughed. Same thing, really. A familiar clicking sound made Danny turn around. Vornax approached them, his forearms folded across his chest. The Selthari looked different than he had a year ago. His compound eyes were softer, and his antennae moved slowly instead of with their usual sharp, aggressive twitching. Danny, Vornax said, I wish to speak with you before the ceremony. Danny nodded. Over the past year, Vornax had changed more than anyone. After Danny answered the riddle, the Selthara genius had fallen into a deep depression. His entire identity had been built on being the smartest being in any room. And a human had proven that intelligence alone was not enough. But instead of giving up, Vornax had done something unexpected. He had asked Danny to teach him. For months, they had met in the library, and Danny had shared what he knew about human philosophy. They discussed doubt and uncertainty. They talked about questions that had no answers. They debated the value of not knowing. It was strange at first. Vornax kept trying to turn everything into equations. But slowly, something shifted. The brilliant Selthari began to understand that knowledge was not the same as wisdom. I wanted to thank you, Vornax said. Before you go out there, you changed the way I think. You changed the way my entire species thinks. The Zothari Collective has begun incorporating human philosophical concepts into our education system. Danny smiled. That means a lot, Vernax, truly. The Zothari made a sound that Danny had learned was the equivalent of a smile. You are still intellectually inferior to me in almost every measurable way. But you have taught me that some things cannot be measured. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Do not get used to it. A bell chimed, signaling the start of the ceremony. Danny took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. The Hall of Infinite Thought was packed with more beings than Danny had ever seen in one place. Aliens of every shape, size, and color filled the seats. In the front row sat the members of the Galactic Council, including High Chancellor Mevris, whose energy form glowed warm and bright. Professor Yethkon stood at the central platform. Waiting for him, Danny walked across the stage, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He reached the platform and turned to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Yethkon said, her golden patterns pulsing steadily, "honored guests from across the galaxy. Before we begin the graduation ceremony, I wish to make an announcement." She turned to Danny. "For 4,000 years, I have served as a professor at this institute. I have taught countless students from countless species. But my true purpose was always the final enigma, the riddle I asked again and again, waiting for the being who would understand its meaning." Her voice grew softer. "That being has finally arrived. And so my work is done." A murmur ran through the crowd. "I am retiring," Professor Yethkon said. "After 4 millennia, I will step down from my position and spend my remaining years in peaceful contemplation." The murmur grew louder. Professor Yethkon had been a fixture at the Institute for longer than most civilizations had existed. The idea of her leaving seemed impossible. "But I do not leave you without a replacement," she continued. "The Council has approved my choice for the new professor who will take my place. He will teach a new course, one that has never been offered at this institute before. A course on the philosophy of questions." She turned to Danny. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Danny Lawson, the first human faculty member at the Velthry Institute of Universal Knowledge." The hall exploded with applause. Danny felt tears forming in his eyes. A year ago, he had been mocked for being a primitive creature from a backward planet. Now he was being asked to teach the greatest minds in the galaxy. He stepped forward to the speaking platform. "I don't have a long speech prepared," he said. "Honestly, I still don't really understand how I ended up here. I'm not the smartest person in this room. I'm probably not even the smartest human in this room." He looked at Kira, who was wiping tears from her eyes in the front row. "But I've learned something important this year. Intelligence is a gift, but wisdom is a choice. You can be the smartest being in the universe and still miss the most obvious truths. And you can be an ordinary person from a small planet and still have something valuable to share." He paused and looked out at the thousands of faces watching him. "Professor Yethkon told me about the human philosopher who inspired her riddle. His name was Marcus Hayes, and he was a simple teacher from Earth. He had no special powers, no advanced technology. He was just a man who spent his life asking questions and helping others ask questions too." Danny smiled. "That's what I want to do here. I don't have answers, but I have plenty of questions. And I hope that together we can keep searching for meaning, knowing that the search itself is what matters." He stepped back from the platform, and the applause grew even louder after the ceremony as the crowd slowly dispersed. A young Zothari student approached Danny nervously. She was small for her species, and her antennae twitched with anxiety. "Professor Lawson?" she said quietly. "May I ask you something?" Danny knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Of course. What's your question?" The young Zothari hesitated. "What is the meaning of life?" The hall was nearly empty now. Most of the guests had left, but Danny's friends remained, watching from a distance. Kira, Mornax, Professor Yethkon, High Chancellor Mevris. Danny looked at the young student and smiled. "That's a wonderful question," he said. "Let me answer it with a question of my own. Why do you want to know?" The student thought for a moment. "Because I feel like there must be a reason for everything. A purpose. And if there wasn't a reason?" Danny asked gently. "If there was no purpose waiting to be found, what would you do then?" The student's antennae stopped twitching. She was silent for a long moment. "I would keep looking anyway," she said. Finally, Danny's smile grew wider. "Then? I think you already know the answer." He stood up and offered her his hand. "Welcome to my class."